Today, I will tell you about the Vulture, the most mass-produced light fighter in the galaxy during the Separatist Crisis and the Clone Wars. Even after the Clone Wars, countless Vultures still flew throughout the galaxy. The topic is a good one. At first glance, this drone may seem like an ordinary tin can, a relatively cheap mechanical dummy that any trained pilot could handle. And those who thought so, who underestimated the Vultures, usually did not live until the next day. By the way, there were few such individuals in the distant galaxy. Most of those who encountered Vultures in combat took them seriously. In this video, we will take a detailed look at the design of this small but very effective starfighter and the history of its combat use. So, the Vulture Droid starfighter. Its full and official name is quite long. The Variable Geometry Self-Propelled Battle Droid Mark I. There was no second model in the official designations, but as you will soon see, there were plenty of modifications to the Vulture. Speaking about the Vulture, Runa Hako, one of the leaders of the Trade Federation, once said, "Droids do not chatter. They do not question your orders and never complain when you send them on suicide missions." He was right. Like everything else, the Vulture had its ancestor, its predecessor. Shortly before the attempted occupation of Naboo, the fleet of the Trade Federation still had many officers, sailors, and pilots of flesh and blood. That is, not droids. It is worth noting that the Trade Federation's starfighters were piloted for most of its history. Small, light starfighters. The traders always preferred light machines, so they took up less space and could deter pirates if they decided to take an interest in the contents of a freighter's hold. The last manned starfighter of the Trade Federation was the Scarab, a flat, small, and very nimble machine. A wonderful thing, not even requiring a specially equipped hangar, although it was still desirable to have one. For the Scarab, a spacious cargo hold of a ship was enough. Although Scarab, and later Vultures, were located not only in the holds of huge transports but also in the hangars of specialized military ships of the Trade Defense Force, TDF. That was the official name of the military fleet of the Trade Federation. Many design ideas that then passed on to the main hero of today's story were embodied in the Scarab. The associations, by the way, are not accidental. The inhabitants of Nemoidia love everything related to beetles. There are countless beetles on Nemoidia. Some beetles they ate, others they used in construction, and on the third they rode. There was even a knightly order of beetle knights in its pre-industrial age. The Scarabs were developed and mass-produced at the factories of Haor Chal Engineering on the planet Charos IV. This is in the Taldot sector, in the mid-rim. The indigenous inhabitants of Charos are an insectoid race, calling themselves She-Charians. The Scarab had only one advantage: a speed ranging from 100 to 105 mglt space units, like TIE Fighter, by the way. However, in the atmosphere it was comparatively slow, only about 900 kilometers per h. Maneuverability was also unimpressive. The armament was modest, 2 dual-barreled heavy blaster cannons. There was no armor. However, the Scarab was equipped with a deflector shield. The main advantage of the Scarab was its cost. It was surprisingly cheap. As the Trade Federation's TDF became saturated with battle droids, Scarabs were also made unmanned by simply installing a droid processor in the starfighter's cockpit. But such a crude conversion of a piloted machine into a drone did not go well. A new starfighter was needed, which became the Vulture. During the Trade Federation's intervention on Naboo, Scarabs were already considered outdated, though they still continued to fly and fight in secondary roles. The traders did not send the Scarabs to scrap, deciding to use the old starfighters to the maximum. A certain number of them even survived until the Clone Wars. For instance, in 21 BBY, less than a year after the start of the Clone Wars, they fought in the Battle of Kothlis, and in the new canon, Scarabs also took part in the battles for the Queller sector in the colony's region. The new starfighter, the Vulture, was created by the same insectoids, the She-Charians from the planet Charos IV, from the company Haor Chal Engineering. This time they created a starfighter in their own image. Calling the Vulture beautiful and aesthetic is difficult. The main thing is that it is cheap, simple, and effective. More accurately, the starfighter was created by religious fanatics from the She-Charian order, which included Haor Chal Engineering. Their religion is also called She-Charian. They believed that life was merely a reflection of paradise, where everything was precise and orderly. By creating machines, they brought themselves closer to God. And the more complex the mechanism, the closer they were to God and paradise. The work on creating machines was their prayer. And the harder this work was, the more effective was the prayer. The factory of Har Chol more resembled churches or cathedrals. Like its predecessor, the primary weapon of the Vulture was the dual-barreled blaster cannons. Why blasters and not lasers? The mechanisms of blasters, that is, plasma cannons, took up less space and required less energy. This is crucial for such small-sized starfighters. With the same size and mass, a blaster possesses greater destructive power but less penetration capability. Although this is not important, as Vultures did not shoot at large ships and targets with good deflector shield anyway. Other disadvantages of blasters included comparatively short effective firing range and greater cooling system requirements. Therefore, the Shi-Charians installed their own manufactured blaster cannons. Although later, including during the Clone Wars, versions of Vultures with laser cannons were often encountered. At that time, incidentally, in the Clone Wars, Vultures were sometimes seen with 6 light laser cannons. The cannons were mounted between the extendable wings. Although after transformation, they became legs. They were made extendable to protect the fragile mechanisms of the cannons from collisions with small asteroids and space debris. In the wings, there were energy cells for either blasters or lasers, depending on the type of cannon installed. If the cannons were blaster type, there was also a converter block that transformed gas into plasma. This is called an exciter. Remarkably, the starfighter itself was powered by other energy cells, and the engine by yet a third source. But more on that later. The auxiliary weaponry of the Vulture included energy torpedo or missile launchers. First off, what is an energy torpedo? It is not a torpedo in the conventional sense. Torpedoes were a mass of plasma enveloped in a magnetic field. Upon contact with a target, the field would collapse, releasing the plasma charge. Energy torpedoes had significant destructive power, but their drawbacks included very short range due to the quickly weakening field and low accuracy. Another disadvantage was their low rate of fire. The number of ammunition was theoretically unlimited as long as the batteries lasted. However, considering the brevity of the combat, Vultures rarely managed to fire more than a couple of torpedoes, so more often on Vultures could be seen classic launchers with 6 mini-rockets with high explosive warheads or 2 rockets with buzz droids. They posed almost no threat to ships larger than a light transport or corvette, but they could easily turn a starfighter or bomber into a shapeless piece of metal. The rockets were not very accurate, but forced the enemy to be nervous, change their attack direction, break formation, and sometimes even take losses. Bombs, serious anti-ship rockets, or torpedoes the Vulture could not carry. Later, the Hyena-class bomber was created based on it for this purpose. The Vulture could threaten ground targets only with its blasters or lasers, which it regularly did during the war, though not always successfully. There was also a Vulture variant with ion cannons instead of lasers. It is unclear why this was done. An encounter with a squadron of ion Vultures was faced by Ahsoka and Padme once. This occurred in the 12th episode of the animated series Star Wars Forces of Destiny. The Vulture's energy, not tied to the weapon system, powered a battery block in the front part of the starfighter. These energy cells were recharged directly from the energy system of the ship on which the starfighter was based. The starfighters hung under the ceiling of the hangar or cargo hold like sleeping bats. Incidentally, it was precisely these bats that inspired Lucas and his creative team when designing the Vulture. A very clever decision, both from the perspective of stylistic features of cinema, particularly the franchise in general, and from the perspective of common sense. Because if all these fighters are placed on the hangar floor, it will be very cramped. And most importantly, there will be no room for cargo. After all, it was precisely to protect the cargo from pirates that droid starfighters were created. The idea of placing fighters on specialized ramps under the ceiling was later adopted by Imperial engineers when they were figuring out how to place fighters on the Imperial I-class Star Destroyer and Victory-class Star Destroyer, as well as when designing the architecture of the hangars of ground bases. In the deactivated mode, The Vulture was connected directly to the ship's power systems and recharged directly from the reactor. That's where Anakin accidentally got into in the first episode. The creators of the container ship turned into an aircraft carrier did not even think of removing such a vulnerable point somewhere in the body. They couldn't imagine that someone would be foolish or brave enough to fly inside the hangar. However, Anakin ended up there by accident. In this suspended state, diagnostics and adjustments of the Vulture's systems, installation and recharging of torpedoes as well as refueling were carried out. By the way, regarding refueling, if the fighter were created by humans or a race close to humans, these same energy cells, only of increased power and size, would also power the ion engines. But the somber ingenuity of the Shi-Charians went against the system here as well. Instead of classic engines, the Shi-Charians installed a concentrated solid fuel engine on the Vulture. Fuel briquettes were located in the rear part of the fighter in a single block with the engine. Each engine required 4 of them. This fuel burned at a very high temperature, generating an enormous surge of energy, making the Vulture fast and fairly maneuverable. In addition, the droid could perform maneuvers and aerobatics that would kill a live pilot if he flew without a gravitational compensator. Additionally, such a fighter was quite compact and lightweight. The Vulture could accelerate up to 100 mglt, meaning it was as fast as the Imperial TIE fighter. Atmospheric speed was 1,180 kilometers per hour, but everything has its price. In this case, the price was a short flight duration of only 35 minutes. But this was more than enough for the machine, considering the fact that space battles in Star Wars usually do not last long. This was quite sufficient for one combat sortie. Moreover, the Vulture did not need to constantly fly around. It could transform into a walker and land on the hull of its carrier ship. The Shi-Charians understood that if the battle dragged on, the fighter would have to return to its ship for refueling. And this was usually a long process. What to do? And here, the resourceful Shi-Charians didn't lose their heads. If a quick refueling was needed, the Vulture, upon flying into the hangar, would simply drop the engines. Special manipulators would immediately attach a new engine filled with fuel to it. The entire procedure took no more than a minute, and the discarded engine could be refueled at a later convenient time. However, this necessitated carrying a certain number of spare engines on board the ship. If there was no rush, the fuel briquettes were replaced by maintenance droids or mechanical manipulators in the hangar when the fighter was suspended from the ceiling. While other Galaxy engineers were figuring out how to refuel a fighter faster, the Shi-Charians invented jettisonable engines. Naturally, the drone did not have a hyperdrive engine. When the Vulture was being created, no one even considered the possibility of its installation, and the customer didn't require it in the tactical technical assignment. The Trade Federation needed a lightweight, short-range fighter to protect its transport ships. There was no need to travel long distances to pirates and competitors, especially with a massive fleet of ships, almost each of which could serve as a carrier. And then Palpatine wanted to acquire fighters for certain special secret missions, specifically to assist his carefully maintained the Trade Federation in capturing Brental. Through his secret agents and intermediaries, Palpatine ordered the shipbuilding company Trincata Starships to assemble 50 Vultures with hyperdrives. The company's factory was located on the planet Esseles in the DARPA sector. It is not specified how and with what help the hyperdrives were delivered there. Most likely an external hyperdrive was used, as in the case of the Delta-7 class light interceptor. The installation of ultra-small hyperdrives was illegal in the Republic. Therefore, as soon as the order was placed, it was reported to the Jedi Order. To conduct an investigation on Esseles, the Order sent Jedi Master Adi Gallia. By the way, this Jedi was an excellent pilot and had a thorough understanding of ships, especially fighters. Since this is not the topic of today's discussion, I will only say that nothing significant came of Palpatine's plans. Before the Jedi's visit and the shutdown of the factory, a few Vultures with hyperdrives were assembled, but they were quickly destroyed. The saga with this modification is described in the 4-part series of stories Star Wars, Episode 1 Adventures. Since we are talking about modifications, it is worth mentioning another interesting variant of the Vulture. There is a planet in the Outer Rim, in the Dastan sector, called Valahari. It exists in both the old and the new canon, and in the same status. The people on Valahari are known for their passion for flying. Each resident's level of flying skill rivals that of the aces from other planets, and they are also knowledgeable about fighters and bombers. During the Clone Wars, the planet adhered to neutrality, but made exceptions for money. Viscount Valahari, named Harco Vane, was an old friend of Count Dooku. Out of friendship and for money, his engineers upgraded several hundred vultures. The upgraded fighters turned out to be much faster and more maneuverable than their base model. Even the simplest vulture flew very fast. The power of the cannons was also significantly increased. Of course, they did not plan to modernize all vultures in this way. It would have been too expensive and simply impossible, considering the limited production capabilities of local facilities and the ongoing war. However, creating a couple of tens of thousands of upgraded droids for special squadrons was feasible. In the real Kroon system in the Noonian sector, the updated vultures without any problems utterly destroyed the task force of the Republic fleet under the command of Jedi Master Tolus Chek. Unfortunately for the Separatists, the Jedi managed to transmit his scanner and sensor data to the General Headquarters a few moments before his death. The command of the Grand Army was both surprised and impressed. Quite quickly, they understood who had created such vultures. The Council dispatched Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker to the planet Valahari to investigate the happenings. In the end, the Separatists' plans fell through once again. They never received the large numbers of upgraded vultures they had anticipated. You can learn the details in the comic arc Hero of the Confederacy. Now let's return to the construction of the fighter. High-temperature solid fuel engines, plasma guns, electronics, all these naturally heated up. For cooling, two modules were used, placed right behind the power cells and the energy converter. The electronic brain of the machine was located in the most obvious place, in the head. The fighter did have artificial intelligence, but it was very primitive. It served merely to unload the central processor, the droid control ship. This ship already had to manage hundreds of thousands of combat and auxiliary droids. This mainly concerned B-1 battle droids and droidecas. The fighter differed from them in that it acted according to a pre-installed program and used pre-formed tactical patterns in combat. This made the Vulture highly predictable, something opposing fighter pilots could successfully exploit, provided they had enough inventiveness, cunning, and life experience, as well as technical knowledge of the opposing side. However, hitting the Vulture was another matter entirely. It was small, only about 7 meters in length and about 1 meter in height, with early variants being even smaller, small and very fast. With a combination of a droid control ship and primitive artificial intelligence, there were no issues during local skirmishes with pirates. But once the forces of the Trade Federation first engaged in full-scale combined arms battles, where tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of battle droids simultaneously participated, the processors of the droid control ship could not cope. As a result, the droid's reactions were delayed. Not even the primitive artificial intelligence could save the situation. Of course, this weakness was understood and recognized even before the fateful Battle of Naboo. However, the Neimoidians not only failed to equip the first series of vultures with full-fledged artificial intelligence, but also placed the droid control ship only on the flagship of the squadron. It was this droid army that Anakin then single-handedly destroyed with one accidental strike, decapitating the entire droid army. Palpatine was displeased. He expected the Neimoidians to be more clever. After the Battle of Naboo, the Neimoidians did allocate funds for the modernization of the vultures. Naturally, the fighter became more expensive. And here it is worth saying a few words about the price. When the first episode was released, the cost of the fighter was unknown. Its price was only first mentioned in the encyclopedia Starships of the Galaxy, 2nd edition, published in December 2007. The price tag, frankly, surprised the fan community. A vulture cost merely 19,000 credits. For comparison, the main light starfighter of the Grand Army at the beginning of the war, the V-19 Torrent starfighter, cost 135,000 credits. In other words, for the price of one V-19 Torrent starfighter, one could buy 7 vultures. And in terms of combat effectiveness, 7 droid starfighters clearly outmatched one V-19 Torrent starfighter. Fans tend to dive into the details of their favorite universe. They calculated that, in this case, the Confederacy's fighter component significantly surpassed the Republic's in overall combat capabilities. The authors of the official encyclopedia acknowledged their mistake several years later. They then concocted a new price, though few paid attention to it, as this number was published in a supplement instead of the main encyclopedia. The new price appeared more realistic: 40,000 credits for a single Vulture. This same figure, 40,000, was repeated in the newest guide, Rise of the Separatists. Thus, the official price became 40,000 credits. However, 40,000 credits was the price of a Vulture during the Clone Wars period, when it was equipped with full-fledged artificial intelligence, about which I will speak further. But the Vulture from the period of the Battle of Naboo, that is, the earlier series of fighters, should have cost somewhat less. Consequently, in the first episode, the price of a Vulture ranged from 32,000 to 34,000 credits per unit. Not cheap, but not overly expensive either. Let me remind you, a simple V-19 Torrent starfighter. Starfighter cost 135,000 credits, which is 3 times more expensive. Its successor, the light Alpha 3 Nimbus class. V-Wing. Starfighter cost somewhat less, 102,500 credits, which is 2.5 times more expensive. The heavy RC-170 starfighter cost 155,000 credits, 3.8 times more expensive. Heavy starfighters are, of course, a different weight category. But since they also participated in battles with Vultures, it is worth mentioning them. At first glance, it may seem that in terms of economic efficiency, a starfighter with a living pilot surpasses a drone, as what does it cost a clone, trained practically from birth, to shoot down 3 or 4 ships? But I have not yet mentioned the most expensive component in any flying apparatus: the spacers between the pilot's cradle and the instrument panel. Clone Marines cost very much, and clone pilots even more. The exact cost of an adult trained clone is unknown, but it is easy to assume that the pilot cost far more than the craft he flew on. I'm saying this to highlight the economic efficiency of droid starfighters far outshined that of the Grand Army of the Republic. Moreover, the droids were manufactured not just quickly, but very quickly. Building a factory was simpler, faster, and cheaper, which meant that the Confederacy found it significantly easier to replenish losses among its fighters. In fact, this factor of rapid droid production had been successfully utilized thousands of years prior to the events of the films. Many ancient armies, including the Galactic Republic itself, actively used battle droids since the times of the Mandalorian and Sith Wars. In essence, the army of the ancient Galactic Republic was an organic combination of humans and other races with battle droids. This resulted in a highly effective combat symbiosis. Similarly, opponents of the Republic, such as the Sith Empire, thought along the same lines. In the Star Wars universe, technology is very cheap, much cheaper than training a pilot. In reality, it is usually the opposite. An airplane is more expensive than the person piloting it. Returning to the electronic brains of the Vulture droids, by the beginning of the Clone Wars, all droid starfighters had received a fully fledged artificial intelligence. This was not an intelligence at the level of a protocol droid or an assassin droid, but the machines could already act independently in battle, no longer bound irrevocably to a droid control ship. However, a control ship was still needed as a coordination center. Operators on the droid control ship now only gave general orders to the drones, such as which area to advance to, what to do there, which targets were priorities, and so on. The machines would then figure out for themselves how to execute these tasks. Though they couldn't entirely abandon their predictable behavior patterns, at least the machines achieved the necessary degree of autonomy. Moreover, now a droid control ship was placed on every warship or space station. This was the right move, because if the droid control ship was only on a single carrier, it instantly became a tempting target for the enemy, and it would draw all the attention of the enemy artillery guns and missiles. Previously, with the Trade Federation, if the ship with the droid control ship was destroyed, the entire squadron simultaneously lost its fighter cover. But during the Clone Wars, if a ship to which a squadron was assigned was destroyed, the control over the remaining Vultures was taken over by the operators of another ship's droid control ship. Additionally, the droids could coordinate their actions among themselves, communicating via both ordinary communication methods and via voice. The electronic language of the vultures could only be understood by other droids. Droids spoke verbally when there was no possibility to use a comlink, for example, when communication was jammed by enemy electronic warfare resources. The droids readily followed any order from an operator on a droid control ship and the squadron commander. In particular, this allowed Grievous to use vultures for suicidal attacks on Republican ships and civilian targets, turning the unmanned fighters into analogs of cruise missiles. He would attach a couple of hundred explosives to a drone and send it on its final flight. Grievous's attacks with vultures were not only directed against military targets, but also against civilians, aiming to sow chaos amongst the enemy. Often, he succeeded in this endeavor. It is relevant here to answer a frequently asked question. Why did the Trade Federation and later the Confederacy opt for unmanned fighters, the droid starfighters? The reason lies in the fact that both the traders and the Confederates were building their armies in secrecy from the Republic. Although in both cases the creation of a full-fledged separatist army of droids was a secret, everyone, including the Republic, was aware of it. However, they could do nothing about it. The true size of the mechanical horde was the only thing successfully kept under wraps. Droids do not gossip, and they can keep secrets as well as a grave. On the other hand, recruiting millions of living pilots for a fighter corps in secret while maintaining confidentiality was simply impossible. Moreover, it was extremely expensive, and most importantly, there was simply nowhere to get them from. Recruiting their kin and fellow citizens was practically impossible, as there were evidently few volunteers in the worlds of the Trade Federation. Therefore, the reliance on drones was justified. Another curious fact about early vultures is connected with the previous point secrecy. When beginning militarization, the participants of the Trade Federation were so afraid that it would become obvious that they equipped all vultures with a self-destruct system to prevent the fighter from being captured by enemies. The system worked simply. Upon losing contact with the droid control ship, the droid starfighter would explode after 6 minutes. However, it would cease functioning just 12 seconds after losing contact. In the beginning of its operation, this led to several unpleasant incidents. Due to technical malfunctions in the communication system, a huge Trade Federation ship lost all its activated fighters at once. No contact, no war. Therefore, after the battles over Naboo, the Nemoidians removed the self-destruction system. If the enemy had good electronic warfare means or a group of skilled hackers, they could easily deprive Trade Federation ships of their fighter cover by simply disrupting communications. During the Clone Wars, vultures already had some artificial intelligence, which did not require constant contact with the droid control ship. Weak, but it was sufficient. Additionally, the resistance to electronic warfare of the vultures turned out to be at a good level in the end. Simple electronic warfare measures couldn't break through it. However, there was a unique modification of the vulture with fully developed artificial intelligence. During the years of the Galactic Civil War in the Dantooine system in the Reobalo sector around the detritus satellites, there existed an independent community of sentient droids. There, vultures with well-developed artificial intelligence were found. They engaged in trade and interacted with criminal syndicates. Naturally, they were not only vultures. There were many different models of droids. In particular, the droids signed a non-aggression pact with the galaxy's largest criminal syndicate, Black Sun. The community did not last long, merely a couple of decades, but it is an interesting and revealing example. Vultures could be made very intelligent, and as demonstrated by the example of the Valahari, also possessed excellent combat characteristics with the proper skill, desire, and resources. However, all of this required money. So much money that a light fighter ceased to be simple and relatively cheap cannon fodder for space battles, turning into something special. But let's get back to the standard vultures. Precisely because of their weak intelligence, the number of machines in the squadrons of the Trade Federation, and later the Confederacy of Independent Systems, was larger than was customary at the time for squadrons of piloted fighters. For comparison, a typical fighter squadron of the Grand Army of the Republic numbered 12 machines. while a squadron of the Trade Federation, and later the Confederacy, had from 32 to 64 fighters per squadron. That is, the size of a Confederacy squadron in terms of the number of machines was comparable to an air wing of the Grand Army. Although it should be noted that the Confederacy squadrons composed of live pilots also numbered 12 fighters. After all, the Confederacy of Independent Systems, CIS, had not only droid starfighters in its arsenal. To compensate for the shortcomings of artificial intelligence and firepower, Vultures used different tactics and formations, flying in groups of 3 fighters instead of the more common pair. Interestingly, Imperial TIE fighters also often operated in 3s rather than pairs. In a CIS squadron or operational unit, there were usually from 1,000 to 4,000 Vultures. Naturally, the increased number of squadrons and air wings required corresponding financial expenditures. Besides the electronic brain in the droid's head, there were its sensory organs. Sensors. The red eyes you saw in the movies and cartoons are long-range sensors, the principle of which is similar to modern active phased array radar, APAR. APAR on the Vulture operated in the meter range. Vulture also had optical sensors, the operation principle of which is similar to the terrestrial optical landing system. They were located directly beneath the long-range sensors. Shicharians based the optical sensors on the droid marine's optical sensors. There, under the optical landing system, was another pair of components, electromagnetic radiation sensors. If desired, they could be replaced with thermal imagers. It was difficult and sometimes impossible to jam all detection and guidance channels of the droid. The issue of the overview was interestingly resolved. Instead of installing a rear-view camera, the droid was merely allowed to turn its head as it pleased. However, it could not look behind its back like an owl. That is, the droid could be followed unnoticed. Some noted that it was a mistake to place the droid's brain and all detection systems in one block, in the machine's head. However, the fighter was already too small and quite fragile. There was no point in spreading all these systems throughout the body, simultaneously increasing its dimensions. They concentrated everything in one place and were happy, a correct decision from an ergonomic point of view. Now let's talk about the legs. Although the Vulture was primarily designed for space and atmospheric battles, and secondarily for ground attack missions, the machine, strangely enough, proved to be useful in ground operations as well. The fighter could transform into a walker. The transformation was handled by simple hydraulic and pneumatic systems. Simple, cheap, reliable, and tested over millennia. The developers initially planned this to enable landings on all types of surfaces, and to give the droid more mobility on airbases. It's nice when a landed fighter can walk itself to the hangar for repair. But during operation, it was discovered that the Vulture could easily land without transforming into a walker. Even more pleasantly in walker mode, the Vulture could cause a lot of trouble to the enemy, accompanied by shooting and explosions. But on the ground, the combat capabilities of the basic version of the Vulture were limited. It could only use launchers for energy torpedoes or missile launchers. This was because it relied on the legs, where the cannons were housed, for walking. As mentioned earlier, during the Clone Wars, there were Vultures with 6 light laser cannons. 2 of them were installed in place of the launchers. Such a Vulture in walker mode was even more dangerous to infantry. However, when encountering an enemy, it was still better to take off if there was enough fuel. When it happened that the Vulture had to fight in close combat, the droid could strike with its legs. Due to the powerful pneumatics, the legs could sometimes be used as a ram to break down doors. The Trade Federation realized long before the Battle of Naboo that Vultures in walker mode made a good complement to droid marine squads patrolling occupied planets. Consider this. The squad is accompanied by a fairly large combat machine that is difficult to disable with light firearms. But at the same time, it enhances the droid squad's firepower with torpedoes or missiles, and if necessary, it can take off and support the squad from the air, or conduct reconnaissance. In walker mode, the Vulture consumed only energy cell charges, not rapidly depleting fuel bricks. Even before the Clone Wars, but during the years of the Separatist crisis, officers of the Trade Federation found another use for the transformation. Recall the beginning of Episode 3, where we see Vultures clinging to Invisible Hand, Grievous's flagship. The legs of the Vultures were equipped with magnetic clamps, allowing the droid to secure itself to the ship's hull. It may seem like a small detail, but this small detail provides a huge tactical advantage. Response time of fighters to a threat significantly decreases. All fleets with living pilots always have to keep a pair or a flight on standby in the air, so they can promptly respond to a suddenly appearing enemy, or just a suspicious starship. If flying through a dangerous area, a standby squadron would be launched. A second squadron would be in a state of readiness for takeoff. However, even in the case of a sudden enemy attack, it needed time to take off, and all this led to pilot fatigue. They constantly had to stay near their fighters. But how did the Separatists act? Emerging from hyperspace, releasing a couple hundred fighters from the hangar, those fighters cling to the hull of your ship, and you're sitting content, fully confident you can repel any sudden attack, or at least engage the attacking fighters, bombers, and corvettes with gunships. During the Clone Wars, and immediately after the war, Separatist generals and admirals successfully used the Vulture's ability to transform to organize ambushes on planets among asteroids or shipwrecks. A couple dozen Vultures would set up in craters or voids of asteroids, cutting off all systems to avoid detection and waiting for the enemy. Just imagine the tactical possibilities this provided Separatist admirals. But let us go back a bit. When did this unrecognized masterpiece first appear in the arsenal of the Trade Federation? This landmark event occurred several years before the events of Episode 1. Before blockading Naboo on the orders of Darth Sidious, the Trade Federation tested its robotic forces on numerous pirate gangs and uncooperative business competitors. In particular, the pirates in the Elrude sector. But first, merchants fought with the pirates, and after the Clone Wars, the Empire seriously took them on, reducing the number of Star Wars corsairs there to almost zero. And it only began to increase during the time of the Galactic Civil War. Rebels also appeared in the sector then, but that's another story. However, successfully fighting pirates didn't always work out. For example, the pirate gang, the Lock Revenants, led by the charismatic leader Nim, couldn't be destroyed by the Trade Federation. This gang operated in the Carthax system from around 40 BBY to the 30s BBY. The guard fighter pilots of the supposedly peaceful, but in fact well-armed planet Naboo first encountered the Vultures near the space station TFP-9. On the Naboo side, the main heroes were the pilots of the Royal Echo Squadron, and then came the blockade and occupation of Naboo. The hangar of the super-heavy Lucrehulk-class LH-3210 cargo freighter had enough space to accommodate 1,500 Vultures, not to mention other military and auxiliary equipment, as well as combat droid marines. Just imagine 1,500 fighters, though these transporters never flew with maximum loads, including during the Clone Wars, when a significant portion of them were armed and converted into battleships and aircraft carriers. This did not greatly reassure the Republicans, because a single ship from the Trade Federation could deploy several hundred fighters in a matter of minutes. Moreover, the ship was excellent, both as a transporter and as an aircraft carrier. Several of these ships were even used by the Rebel Alliance. One of them, acting as an aircraft carrier, delivered over 500 fighters into the battle above Despair, and during the battle managed to deploy 500 X-Wing fighters in 2 waves. Although the rebels were unlucky then, instead of the expected grand victory, they suffered an equally grand but devastating defeat. Although the Trade Federation of Planets lost the battle for Naboo, the Republic nevertheless began to issue bills and resolutions aimed at somehow limiting the militarization of the Trade Federation and similar megacorporations, which in the future founded the Confederacy of Independent Systems. But by then, Palpatine had already become Supreme Chancellor. At the same time, senators from companies and corporations were also trying to figure out what to do with this number of drones. One of these answers was the creation of the heavily armed carrier cruiser, the Venator-class Star Destroyer, with its numerous air group, characteristic type of hangar, and a huge number of light rapid-fire guns, laser anti-aircraft guns. It had as many as 52 of them, but the huge hangar of the Venator and its tilt towards anti-aircraft guns were the reason that only 16 main guns could be installed on it, although the war showed that even those 16 turbo lasers in 8 twin-gun turrets were often enough. And then suddenly, the Clone Wars began, and just as suddenly, The Republic had a clone army that the Confederates clearly did not anticipate. The Vultures fought valiantly throughout the entire war, from the first salvo on Geonosis to the final moments over Coruscant, Utapau, and thousands of other fronts in the Galactic War. If frigates, cruisers, and battleships were the cudgel of the Separatists, then Vultures were nails sticking out of it. In the war, the Republican fleet heavily relied on the heavy turbo lasers of large ships and on fighters with bombers. The Vultures engaged in countering these fighters and bombers, protecting their large ships. Aside from this, the Vultures escorted the Hyena-class bombers, also created based on the Vulture. Additionally, they often fired on ground targets, patrolled planets in walker mode, and were deployed wherever the Confederacy fleet was present. The clone pilots confidently defeated the Vultures in close maneuverable combat, even if they were outnumbered 3-1. But the fact is that often the numerical superiority of the droids and fighters was 5-1, and sometimes 10-1. And then no clone skills could save them. They could only hope for luck. In the middle and latter half of the Clone Wars, the Confederacy's fleet had around 1 billion Vultures, which comprised 15,625,000 standard-type squadrons. On one hand, this number is vast, yet even this amount was often insufficient to completely fill the hangars of the Separatist ships. In some Confederate squadrons, Vultures were concentrated on 1 or 2 large carrier ships. The heavy carriers were typically slightly modified freighters from the Trade Federation. Nevertheless, 1 billion fighters is a staggering quantity. Clone pilots understood that for every fighter they shot down, the Confederacy's factories could produce 10 more identical ones. Fortunately for the clones, the Clone Wars ended. They ended as suddenly as they had begun. Something unpleasant and entirely unexpected by many Separatists occurred. The Confederacy lost. First Obi-Wan on Utapau, then Anakin on Mustafar. Of course, the history of the Vultures couldn't end there. It was nearly impossible to withdraw and dispose of 1 billion fighters. The young Galactic Empire diligently accepted, catalogued, and stored everything they could find. Part of the fighters was recycled, while another part was used as training targets for TIE fighter pilots in academies. The foes of the Republic created so many Vultures that cadets could continue destroying them in training battles for many decades. You might be wondering why the Empire itself did not use the Vultures as cannon fodder in space combat. Firstly, the Empire had a different military doctrine and a different fleet utilization concept. Secondly, the Galactic Empire had its own models of droid starfighters, which, however, were not used as extensively, especially before the first death of the Emperor. Imperial droid starfighters existed both in the old and new canon. The temporary shutdown of the droid army dealt a colossal blow to the Separatists' combat capability, but could not completely obliterate anti-Republic, and now anti-Imperial, resistance. The war continued, though by then the forces of the Confederacy remnants were merely a shadow of their recent military might. The young Empire continued to fight them for a long time. Vultures were utilized by absolutely all fragments of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, regardless of whose command they were under. Tunbuk Tura, Marath Vuro, General Kendu Ulto. There were a multitude of such field commanders. Most of them, along with the Galactic Empire's army and fleet, were destroyed in the first 2 years after the war. But with minor fragments, such as the forces of Gaizo Delso, it took until the 12th year BBY to completely subdue them. That means the last organized Separatist resistance was suppressed by the Imperial forces only 7 years after the war's end. Nevertheless, some Separatists managed to survive by hiding far from the Empire's eyes. And when the Alliance emerged, some joined the rebels, some joined with their ships and their droids. Thus, the Rebel Alliance had a certain number of droid starfighters at the onset of the Galactic Civil War. The rebels acquired some droid starfighters by repairing damaged machines found on battlefields, or by discovering fully intact starfighters in deactivated states at abandoned Separatist bases and depots, which had not yet been discovered by the Imperials, smugglers, pirates, or war metal scavengers. It is worth noting that the Separatists had constructed many bases and depots, beginning their construction long before the war. Only a few dozen remained undiscovered, and therefore unplundered by the time the Alliance had arisen. Consequently, the Rebel Alliance, despite the constant shortage of live pilots, still had to primarily rely on manned starfighters. A clear example of the rebels' use of vultures is the secret rebel base established on the planet Zorn in the Farah sector of the Outer Rim territories. The base was simply named Foundry 4. At this base, they knew how to restore severely damaged droids. The equipment and qualifications of the personnel at the base were sufficient to carry out repairs of any complexity. There was also a small factory and a foundry workshop where they could manufacture some parts, weapons, and certain equipment. On this same planet, vultures, old Z-95 headhunters, and even older HH-87 starhoppers were discovered and returned to service. The base personnel and its defenders were an even more diverse force. Among the infantry, there were other separatist droids. Mostly these were B-1 battle droids and droidicas. When the Imperials discovered the base and sent a small task force to it, they had no idea what they would encounter there. Various starfighters, several armed corvettes and armed transports, and on the ground, B-1 battle droids, droidicas, recently liberated armed slaves, professional rebel operatives, armed mechanics, and even Mandalorians. Shortly before the Imperial attack, the rebels had assisted Mandalorians from Clan Awad, led by Nam Baroya and Vera Baroya, who had sent a contingent of 36 experienced warriors and several Mandalorian starfighters. For more details, refer to the book Star Wars, Age of Rebellion Friends Like These, a very interesting story about a rebel cell and the events surrounding it. However, let us return to the Vulture. Despite the Empire's efforts to gather all the combat droids of the defeated Confederacy, they were unable to do so. Various bandits and black market traders from some local governments took thousands of droid starfighters before the Imperials. After repairs, if necessary, and reactivation, the Vultures faithfully served their new masters. And the fleet of the Galactic Empire also had to deal with these drones as they systematically destroyed pirates, smugglers, and other criminals. For example, there is the lesser-known, yet very famous pirate leader in the galaxy, Gun Cutlax, who led the pirate gang, the Iska, though in its size the gang more resembled a fleet, a large pirate fleet. The Imperial fleet, under the command of Admiral Terrenald Screed, fought against him for a long time. Ultimately, the pirate was subdued, and his armada was defeated in 2 major battles. These were the battles near the planet Tosta in the Atravis sector in the Outer Rim territories, and the Battle of Fanha, a planet in the Satia sector, also in the Outer Rim territories. Notably, this pirate, his pirate armada, and his defeat by the Imperials are mentioned in both the Old and New canon. Speaking of the New canon, a vast number of vultures were armed by the militia of the Free Ryloth movement under the command of Cham Syndulla. During the Clone Wars, during the battle for Ryloth, these same Twi'leks under Syndulla's command suffered from vultures, and now droid starfighters were fighting on their side. In 14, before the Battle of Yavin, hundreds of vultures were used by Syndulla in an attack on the Star Destroyer, the Perilous, which was a temporary flagship of Darth Vader. The Star Destroyer was indeed powerful, but neither it nor its air group could handle hundreds of droid starfighters. Or take another example, the adventurer and Imperial hater named Birch Teller, a former employee of Republic and then Imperial intelligence services. After deserting, he formed his own band, which, among other things, harmed the Empire as much as it could. Birch Teller was an experienced operative and a master of sabotage. Specifically, Teller's cell incited an uprising on Umbara. Prior to this, Teller managed to procure around 400 droid starfighters, a vast number. But this was not enough to deal with a certain famous admiral. After all, this was Thrawn from the book, not that blue fool from the Rebels animated series. A certain number of vultures ended up in private ownership on legal grounds. For instance, even in 34, after the Battle of Yavin, wealthy and influential families in Cato Neimoidia had droid starfighters in their private armies. And they weren't the only ones. Many who had the money and means purchased battle droids, including Vulture-class droid starfighters. In the role of bodyguards, vultures worked excellently. I think you'll agree with me that this machine appeared in the right place at the right time in galactic history, in an army suitable for it. The Vulture is good for both protecting merchant property and total war. And even after the war, as you can see, the Vulture was useful to many interesting individuals and organizations. serving as reliable protection for them and as a flying problem for their opponents.